The shadows of past traumas have a devastating way of eclipsing the brightest moments of the present, a tragic reality that Isaiah recently discovered in his desperate attempt to bring light back into Eva's life. Recognizing the profound sadness that had taken residence in Eva's eyes since her harrowing near death experience, Isaiah meticulously orchestrated what was meant to be a flawlessly romantic evening. Every detail of the night was curated with an overwhelming sense of love and a desperate yearning to help her forget, even if just for a few hours, the agonizing trials she had recently endured. The ambiance was perfectly tuned to offer comfort and safety, bathed in the soft, flickering glow of candlelight that danced across the walls of their shared sanctuary. Isaiah's intentions were entirely pure. He wanted nothing more than to remind Eva of the beautiful, vibrant woman she was before tragedy struck, hoping that a night of uninterrupted affection might bridge the widening emotional chasm between them. However, the delicate illusion of normalcy was shattered in an agonizing instant of unintended consequence. As the evening progressed into a space of quiet intimacy, Isaiah's hand gently and lovingly grazed the area of Eva's abdomen where her surgical scar lay hidden beneath her clothing. The physical contact meant only to convey tenderness and devotion, instead acted as a catastrophic trigger. In a fraction of a second, the romantic atmosphere evaporated, replaced by an atmosphere of sheer, unadulterated terror. Eva's reaction was visceral and immediate. She violently pushed Isaiah away, her body trembling uncontrollably as a primal panic hijacked her nervous system. The suddenness of her recoil left the room suffocatingly silent, save for the ragged, desperate gasps of air escaping Eva's lungs as she scrambled backward, pressing herself against the furthest corner of the room as if trying to escape an invisible predator. The root of Eva's terrifying reaction was deeply embedded in a devastating psychological complex that had quietly taken root in her mind. In the agonizing aftermath of the incident, as she looked at Isaiah's shocked and heartbroken expression, Eva's internal monologue was a cacophony of self-loathing and despair. She had convinced herself, with the twisted logic that trauma so often provides, that she was fundamentally broken and irreparably damaged. The scar on her abdomen was not just a mark of survival to her, it was a grotesque reminder of her vulnerability, a physical manifestation of her perceived inadequacy. She harbored a deep-seated, paralyzing belief that Isaiah, or anyone else for that matter, could never truly love a woman who was no longer whole. In her mind, the scarred tissue was a permanent defilement, rendering her unworthy of the gentle, unblemished love that Isaiah was so desperately trying to offer her. Witnessing the sudden and violent rejection from the woman he loved left Isaiah in a state of profound emotional agony and bewildering confusion. He had approached her with nothing but reverence, and to be met with such absolute terror felt like a physical blow to his chest. The stark contrast between his unconditional adoration and her absolute repulsion created a devastating paradox that he could not immediately comprehend. It was in the wake of this heartbreaking encounter that Ted, Eva's deeply observant and fiercely protective father, recognized the urgent need to intervene before the situation deteriorated beyond repair. Ted quietly pulled Isaiah aside for a deeply emotional and incredibly candid conversation, stepping into the dual role of a seasoned medical professional and a terrified father desperately trying to save his daughter's future. Ted's explanation to Isaiah was a masterclass in compassionate psychiatric understanding, shedding light on the invisible monsters that were currently tearing Eva apart from the inside. With a heavy heart and a solemn tone, Ted articulated that Eva's devastating panic attack had absolutely nothing to do with Isaiah's touch or any lack of love on her part. Instead, he explained that her reaction was a textbook manifestation of severe post traumatic stress disorder stemming directly from the psychological shock of her near death experience. Ted emphasized that while her physical wounds had closed and the surgical sutures had been removed, the psychological lacerations were still gaping wide open. The scar on her abdomen was merely the epicenter of a massive emotional earthquake. Touching it did not just cause physical discomfort, but rather it violently yanked her psyche back to the exact moment she believed her life was ending. The gravity of Ted's paternal fear became heartbreakingly apparent as he continued to confide in Izaiah. Ted confessed his absolute terror that Eva, blinded by her unresolved trauma and suffocated by her own survivor's guilt, was on the precipice of self-sabotage. He watched with a breaking heart as his daughter systematically dismantled the happiest, most stable relationship she had ever known, all because she was held hostage by the ghosts of her recent past. Ted deeply understood that Izaiah was the anchor Eva desperately needed, yet he also knew that trauma often forces victims to isolate themselves from their greatest sources of support. The profound tragedy of the situation weighed heavily on both men. Eva was actively destroying her own sanctuary, convinced that by pushing Izaiah away, she was somehow protecting him from the monstrous reality of her damaged existence. Following the disastrous romantic evening, Eva's behavior took a sharp and concerning downward spiral into total withdrawal. She began to actively shrink away from the world, constructing an impenetrable fortress of ice around her emotions. The once vibrant and communicative doctor became a ghost in her own life, actively avoiding any form of physical or emotional intimacy with Izaiah. The silence between them grew deafening, a palpable void that echoed with unspoken words and unhealed wounds. Eva's coldness was not born of malice, but of a desperate, misguided attempt at self-preservation. By shutting down entirely, she believed she could prevent any further triggers, effectively numbing herself to both pain and love in equal measure, leaving Izaiah to navigate the agonizing reality of loving someone who refused to be loved. Despite Ted's urgent and medically sound advice that she take an extended leave of absence to rest and engage in intensive psychological therapy, Eva's innate stubbornness flared to life. Driven by a frantic need to prove to herself and everyone else that she was perfectly fine, she adamantly refused to step away from her duties. In a defiant display of denial, she forced herself back into the demanding environment of the free clinic. For Eva, the clinic was supposed to be her proving ground, the arena where she could don her white coat like a suit of armor and demonstrate that her intellect and medical prowess remained completely untouched by her trauma. She desperately wanted to believe that if she could just save others, she could somehow magically fix the broken pieces within herself. However, the chaotic, high-stakes environment of a medical clinic is entirely unforgiving to those harboring fragile psychological states. The inevitable collision between Eva's unresolved trauma and her professional duties occurred with devastating force during a seemingly routine shift. The emergency doors burst open, bringing in a severely injured patient who required immediate, life-saving intervention. The sights, the frantic sounds of the monitors, and the overwhelming urgency of the situation were standard fare for a doctor of Eva's caliber. But as she approached the gurney, the stark, brutal reality of the patient's severe open wounds and the unmistakable scent of fresh blood acted as a catastrophic catalyst, shattering the fragile dam she had built in her mind. In the middle of the bustling trauma bay, surrounded by frantic nurses and critical medical equipment, Eva experienced a complete and terrifying psychological paralysis. She was instantly frozen, her body locking up as a massive dissociative episode took hold. She was no longer standing in the brightly lit free clinic. Instead, her mind violently transported her back to the darkest, most terrifying moment of her life. It was a waking nightmare of the most vivid and horrifying kind. She could hear the deafening roar of the storm raging outside. She could feel the freezing, unyielding steel of the elevator floor beneath her, and she could see herself lying helplessly in a massive, expanding pool of her own blood. The sensory overload was absolute, entirely overriding her current reality and plunging her back into the agonizing throes of her near-death experience. Recognizing the immediate and critical danger of the situation, Ted, who happened to be nearby, was forced to intervene with lightning speed. He saw the blank, terrified stare in his daughter's eyes and instantly recognized the complete dissociation taking place. With the patient's life hanging in the balance, Ted had no choice but to step in, physically moving his paralyzed daughter aside to take over the life-saving procedures. It was a moment of profound professional and personal agony for Ted. He was operating not just as a highly skilled physician saving a stranger's life, but as a horrified father watching his child completely disintegrate under the crushing weight of her psychological burdens in front of her colleagues. The aftermath of the emergency room incident culminated in a devastating, tear-filled confrontation behind the closed doors of Ted's office. Operating in his capacity as chief of staff, but speaking with the broken voice of a loving father, Ted was forced to make the agonizing decision to officially suspend Eva from her duties at the clinic. He explained through a veil of tears that her current mental state posed a severe risk not only to the patients who relied on her expertise, but more importantly, to her own survival. Eva's initial reaction of defensive, burning anger quickly crumbled into a puddle of absolute despair. The suspension was the final, undeniable proof that her trauma had entirely consumed her, stripping away the one identity she thought she could still rely on, her identity as a capable, unflappable doctor. In the crushing silence of her suspension, Eva was finally forced to confront a terrifying and heartbreaking epiphany. She realized with absolute agonizing clarity that all her years of rigorous medical training, her vast knowledge of human anatomy, and her logical understanding of the healing process were entirely useless against the primal, unyielding terror that had taken residence in her amygdala. The trauma defied logic. It bypassed her intellect entirely. As she sat in the aftermath of her breakdown, she became acutely aware of a phantom pain radiating from her abdomen. The physical scar, fully healed on the surface, began to throb and ache in perfect, agonizing synchrony with every beat of her panicked heart. It was a relentless physical manifestation of her psychological torment, a constant reminder that the deepest wounds are often the ones that cannot be seen, and that the journey to true healing had not even begun.